In 1639, we may have had our first American sighting of a UFO. And it's kind of an amazing story because it's a well-known Puritan settler that basically came over from England and eventually became the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony. And his name, many of you will know, is John Winthrop. Winthrop very famously described not just sort of Massachusetts, but sort of America as a city on a hill, which is a reference to Jesus saying something similar about Christianity. And it is a way of thinking about America as having a kind of manifest destiny and also a very special place that is a kind of model, a moral model for everyone else. But what's interesting is that Winthrop was out on a boat with his friends in 1639, and they saw some shimmering light appear. And he describes it as, quote, when it stood still, it flamed up and was about 3 yards square. When it ran, it was contracted into the figure of a swine. So it basically was standing still, then it was moving, and it was changing shape. And it was some kind of brilliant light. And he didn't know what to make of it. He wrote to his friends. Others claimed to have seen it too. And then, interestingly, when they sort of gathered their wits about themselves, they were like a mile downstream. And so one suggestion was, well, they just lost track of, what they were doing. One suggestion is that somehow this UFO might have been involved in sort of moving them to a different part of the river, or at the very least, possibly erasing some part of the timeline for them. Then Winthrop actually again sees something. This is later, like a few months later, and this time it's accompanied by strange screams and howls, and the sound of a human voice crying out. And this is dark, like they're basically in a swampy area. And Winthrop suggests that this is related to the sinking of a battleship that had occurred a few months before. And he says that one of the sailors' bodies was never recovered. And it was, in fact, the sailor that they believe had caused the calamity in the first place. So they theorized that the devil had taken over the body of this lost sailor and was now haunting the area and crying out for God knows what kind of hijinks. UFOologist Jacques Vallée actually describes this as a possible example of an early American encounter with a UFO. Today, we're fascinated with this question because we have more and more sightings. I'm going to explain why I think it's hotter than ever at the moment. But I want us to see that it's part of this tradition in America. At the moment, we're having kind of a hugely exciting time in these UAP sightings. A lot of stuff happening on the eastern seaboard with crazy drones that no one can explain. These strange little tic-tac craft that are moving very fast and with weird propulsion. But when I was basically younger in the 1990s, there was another huge fascination with unidentified anomalous phenomena. But in that case, it was the crop circles. Some of you will be old enough to remember that these strange shapes were appearing in farmers' crop fields all around the Midwest. They would be like very elaborate and sort of elegant geometric designs. And some people were speculating, like, who the hell's making these things? I mean, it's just some farmers getting drunk and then going out there with a board and sort of weaving this together, as a hoax. It's possible because some people tried to reproduce it and they could do it using like a 2x4 and a rope and like a hat with a little sort of sighting measure on it. But the sort of the geometric sort of specificity was kind of impressive. And it led some people to think, well, this is where alien crafts might be landing, or maybe these are signs or symbols that aliens are putting for each other to sort of direct them, sort of a traffic directing signal, for where they should go and what they should be doing. It was never resolved. If you go back a little bit earlier than that, sort of in the 1980s and the 70s, you had a lot of alien abductions then. Now you have basically cases where people are being abducted by those aliens that we call the Greys, giant sort of heads with the sort of cat eyes and no nose. And if we go back even earlier, we see, like in 1961, the abduction of Barney and Betty Hill. This is just a married couple driving on the road, and all of a sudden they see a craft emerging, and they can even see inside the craft coming from the skies some kind of alien creature, and then there's just a huge part of their night is missing, and they kind of wake up at home and they try to reconstruct what happened over time with psychologists later, trying to retrieve the memories of it. It's a very famous case, Betty and Barney Hill, 1961. So there is this tradition going all the way back to John Winthrop in the 1600s and all the way up to the present. So today we're going to look at sort of the philosophy, the psychology, the science, and even the logic around UFOs, or sort of unidentified anomalous phenomena. Welcome to Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge. So what's new about, today's UFO sightings or UAP sightings? I think what's new and very unique to the current moment we're in is not really what we're seeing is different, although it does sort of change over time. When you think about the flying saucers of the 1950s and 60s versus these little crafts that we're seeing now, that's an interesting question. Rather, I think what's really unique about our moment is that there's something about the quality of the testimony that has changed recently. So if you look at, for the last 70 years or so, who's reporting seeing unidentified anomalous phenomena? It's by and large the average citizen, people who are just out and about, and then they see something weird, and then they report it, either to a journalist or to a government agency. They call it in. There used to be a sort of a hotline that the government ran, which I think they stopped doing. But in any case, it's basically just schmoes like you and me, Joe Sixpack, calling in a strange sighting. And nothing wrong with that, but something has changed in the last 5 years or so, because now, for the first time, we're actually hearing testimony from different kinds of witnesses. Basically, think about Air Force fighter pilots are sort of reporting these anomalies. Long-standing members of the intelligence community are now reporting this kind of stuff. So there's something different about the testimony, the quality of the testimony that is happening at the current moment. And now the government seems to be explicitly involved. So you'll know that Chuck Schumer, longtime senator, is now calling for a kind of UAP disclosure act of some kind. And he has a bipartisan support for this. So, to quote Schumer, the American public has a right to learn about technologies of unknown origins, non-human intelligence, and unexplainable phenomena. That's Chuck Schumer basically speaking to Congress. And that is from 2023. So that's fairly new stuff. And that's making those of us who traditionally have been very skeptical sort of sit up and pay attention. One question we want to ask ourselves is all this stuff related? The sort of seeing these little tic-tac crafts with crazy propulsion going through the water and up into the air, is that related to the crop circle stuff? Is that related to the Greys and the abductions? Is that related to the weird Betty and Barney Hill stuff? Or is it really that we're just grouping a whole bunch of unrelated stuff under the same sort of general question mark? So that's an interesting question for us to keep in mind as we go through this. Okay, it's pretty clear that the usual options that are given are that you've got sort of foreign or domestic military technology that's secret, and that is the stuff we're seeing. So that's option one. Option two is that they are aliens coming from another planet and investigating us, or they are drones sent by intelligent creatures from another planet coming to investigate us. Those tend to be the only two options that are described. And what I want to talk to you today about is that there are other options. Fairly interesting, some very weird and some very compelling options, but worth looking at. I always thought it was funny that when the crop circle thing was happening, everybody jumped to the idea that, well, these must be aliens that are making the crop circles. And I thought, yeah, maybe, but why is no one talking about the possibility of some super intelligent birds that are now making crop circles? Now, I know that sounds ridiculous, but how is that sort of ruled out and aliens ruled in? That's an interesting question. I mean, the birds we know can't really do this kind of stuff, but what if there's some kind of evolutionary mutation, some kind of Darwinian jump, and without our knowing it, we have a sort of cadre of birds involved in some strange symbolic behaviors in which they peck down the crops in just a certain way? Or why not some super intelligent ground squirrels in a feverish pattern down under the ground, creating the crop circles? Again, seemingly absurd, and yet in philosophy, we call this the reductio ad absurdum argument, where you basically try to show like maybe this view of an intelligent design of the crop circles is consistent with other slightly ridiculous versions. And then you use that to sort of throw cold water on your contending speculation. What's interesting is that whatever is making a crop circle or making these strange patterns in the sky that we can't recognize, it seems to be intelligent. Like nobody thinks it's really like a natural phenomenon, like a tornado going through and creating these things. I mean, we just don't see tornadoes blowing through junkyards and then assembling interesting sort of machines. It doesn't create, and there's sort of a famous thought experiment, could a tornado go through a junkyard and produce a Boeing 747? We don't see it. Nature processes don't seem to build up this kind of complexity. If anything, nature processes seem to basically produce more and more entropy, not more and more structure or design. And so there's a fun example, famous 19th century theologian named William Paley has this thought experiment. He says, imagine you're crossing a heath, just a field, you're just walking through England, as one does in bucolic English countryside, and you see something sticking out of the ground. It's two things, really. One is a rock, and the other looks like a watch of some kind. And so you dig them both up, and you look at them, and Paley says, you know, nobody would look at the rock and think like, oh my God, somebody must have designed this and then placed it here. Because it's just a rock, and rocks just happen as part of basic geology. But if you looked at the watch, you wouldn't say, oh, this just happened here like the rock. The wind and, you know, the nearby surf water sort of washing up on the beach didn't just produce a watch-like structure. Whatever this is must have been made by some kind of intelligence. And so he thinks this is sort of an analogy for thinking about anatomy too. He's a theologian, so he says if you saw a watch, you'd assume a sort of intelligent designer who made it. So if you saw the human body with its elegant eye and its elegant digestive and sort of respiration system and its amazing circulation system, so too you'd think, well, some kind of intelligent designer must have made the human anatomy. So Paley thinks that when you see amazing complexity and structure, it's a sort of effect, and we must infer the cause. And so he thinks the only cause for these kinds of amazing effects would be God. So Paley's thinking in terms of God designing animals. Actually, Darwin read Paley and was very much influenced by him when he was young. And then he came up with an alternative theory about how you get complexity, and of course that's natural selection. So the reason why you have these complex, amazing anatomies and physiologies is because over geological time, natural selection has been selecting for and slowly refining the body so that it can do this kind of respiration of oxygen and it can circulate this kind of blood. And so these incredibly sort of intelligent design looking things are in fact the product of nature. Now, what's interesting about this is David Hume, even before, in the century before, we're talking about the 1700s, David Hume looks at this argument because he knew it well. It's called the design argument or the teleological argument. And he said, yeah, if you saw all this elegant nature, all beautifully designed and harmonic, you might infer the existence of a God that designed it all. But he said, what if it was just like, if you see a spider web, it looks also like the sort of the product of intelligence, but we know that it's just a spider weaving this thing from its anus. So Hume says, what if our universe is basically made by a giant spider, just sort of instinctually weaving it together without any kind of conscious thought or design, just doing it like an instinctual biological activity? Why not that possibility too? In any case, one of the interesting things about the sort of UAP phenomenon is that we assume that what we're seeing has some kind of intelligence behind it. And now the question is, can we infer from these effects the right cause? So we're speculating about what the cause is. And are there multiple causes that could be consistent with these effects? So what other causes besides, military intelligence and aliens could be sitting in the causal position for the effects that we're seeing? So the effects are seen and the causes are hidden. Maybe, now follow me here, it's Bigfoot. Okay, that's probably not going to be very compelling for you. But what if it was like a whole civilization of Bigfoots living underground, and they were basically savvy and could make this stuff too, this technology? Okay, that seems absurd and we have no evidence for it, but it raises a very interesting hypothesis, which we'll call the cryptoterrestrial hypothesis. Are there creatures that are not from another planet, but live somewhere secretly on the Earth, and that also have a kind of civilization and also a technological facility such that they could be making some of these UAPs that we're seeing? Can we rule it out? It seems unlikely, but it's at least as compelling as the aliens thesis, because you could have very smart, sort of undiscovered, hidden species within the Earth, maybe, and possibly within the oceans that have been here all along with us, evolving separately and outside of our sort of line of vision, and now we're having these occasional interactions with them. So keep that in mind, the cryptoterrestrial thesis. I like it. We're going to call that the third possibility, the cryptoterrestrial hypothesis. There's a fourth possibility. What about, instead of extraterrestrials or tech or cryptoterrestrials, what about the ultraterrestrials? And the ultraterrestrials, there's a sort of long-standing tradition that's been around for a few decades now. Possibly you could connect it to all the traditions of mythology, including sort of stuff about fairies and mysterious creatures and angels. So maybe it's a very old hypothesis, but it's caught on more recently under the name or under the banner ultraterrestrial just in the last couple of decades. But this is an interesting idea. The ultraterrestrial thesis is that there are sort of beings that are interdimensional and that live sort of alongside of us. They are, for the most part, invisible to us, but every once in a while, there's some kind of crossing of these domains or dimensions, and we experience them. And that is not a popular hypothesis. Certainly, conventional science would rule it out as being just too far afield. But it's also kind of exciting, and it's unclear why we should rule it out. There's a very interesting Harvard scientist named Tim Lomas. And Tim Lomas has written a piece for the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. And he says, let's consider the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis more carefully. He says, look, intelligent beings are living alongside us in different spatio-temporal frameworks, perhaps. This is just speculation, he knows. And they sometimes overlap with us. But he says, look, that may not be more crazy or more hard to believe. And there are some aspects of experience that make us keep an open mind about this. In fact, this is the point that Tim Lomas wants to sort of underscore. He says, what's important in this conversation is not that we've hit on the answer to the UAP mystery, but rather, he says, we're just trying to open our minds and basically sort of have epistemic humility. Let me quote from the abstract of his paper. There is another hypothesis. Here he's referring to It's not just military tech and it's not just aliens. He says, an unconventional terrestrial explanation outside the prevailing consensus view of life and the universe. This is the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, which includes, but is not limited to, the interdimensional hypothesis, namely the highly speculative notion that UAP may reflect activities of beings from other dimensions that coexist alongside our own. Such hypotheses may rightly be regarded with skepticism by most scientists. However, this paper suggests they nevertheless should not be ruled out and deserve serious consideration in a spirit of epistemic humility and openness. God love you, Tim Lomas. Epistemic humility and openness. This is quite rare, not only in the sciences, but in philosophy, in psychology. It's even just among the average person, it's hard to find epistemic humility. I'm all in favor of it. We should try to increase it wherever possible. Try to sort of receive other people's ideas with a mix of skepticism and charity. It's really rare. And I fail all the time at it, so I'm not on some high horse here. But let us endeavor in the general guide of unusual knowledge to keep the open mind. So, all right, this idea of the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis or the interdimensional hypothesis puts me in mind of a great little proto-science fiction novel by the writer Edwin Abbott. And this comes from the 1880s, and it was called Flatland. Highly recommended. If you get a chance, read Flatland. It's short, it's readable, it's amazing. It's so strange and way ahead of its time. Imagine this, Abbott says. You live in a two-dimensional plane. So imagine you live on a piece of paper, and all of the characters are just geometrical shapes. Like one character is a triangle, another character is a circle, another character is a square. But if you live on a two-dimensional plane of paper, then as you meet your friend coming, the circle, he's really just going to look like a line to you. And when you see your friend, the triangle, coming, they're really going to look like a line. Maybe there's another line that sort of looks less clear because it's, maybe going off in the distance. Unclear how this would work exactly, but it's kind of a wonderful thought experiment. So you're living in this world of two dimensions. That's called Flatland. Then all of a sudden, one of the characters is in his house, living in Flatland, and he starts to see a line appear out of nowhere. And the line is talking to him, and it's growing wider and wider and wider, and then narrower and narrower and narrower, and then it pops out of existence. And he's like, what the fuck? And it turns out this is a character which is a sphere, a three-dimensional sphere. So imagine taking like a baseball and passing it slowly through a piece of paper, and you live on this piece of paper. What are you going to see? You're not going to see the three-dimensional sphere. You're going to see a line just growing as it passes through the plane that you live on and as it passes out of it. And it's talking to you. And so Abbott wonderfully uses this to think about, alternative geometries, sort of non-Euclidean geometries. And he's also thinking theologically, because he says, look, this is sort of what it would be like if God came into your world. You wouldn't really see it, God, or understand God. You'd just sort of be seeing some manifestation or some little sort of picture of God that your little brain could handle. And so this is just a wonderful analogy for thinking about the possibility of an ultra-terrestrial encounter, because perhaps what's happening is when a being from another dimension enters into our three-dimensional world, we basically are only sort of catching the tiniest little feature of it and trying to process it within the framework, the cognitive framework that we have. And so this is a really fun thought experiment. And it's one that really is interesting, because now if you tie it to the UAP phenomenon, it's just a whole realm of speculation. And now I'm not saying this is the answer, because I think there's not much evidence for this, but it's an exciting way of just theorizing about what the causes of weird stuff could be. Now, why do we think that maybe the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis could be reasonable? Because Lomas says there's three phenomena or realities that really admit to a lot of high strangeness. One is the UAP behavior. it seems to be that these crafts are moving in ways that we don't understand and that seem to violate our understanding of propulsion. They'll sort of like appear quickly, almost like immediately. There'll be no sort of ramping up in speed. They seem to go underwater and through the air, and they move from one coordinate to another like almost instantaneously, according to some reports. So that makes Lomas think that maybe this is a sort of an interdimensional phenomenon. That's a possibility. Two, he says, you know what else is highly strange? The universe. And he's right. The universe is very strange. And I hate to be the guy that brings in quantum mechanics whenever things get confusing, but it's kind of it's kind of a deal breaker for when you think the universe is deterministic and predictable. Then along comes the stuff like the uncertainty principle and the bizarre behavior of the very, very subatomic and the very, very large realities that we know about. And so this makes us think, well, maybe interdimensional travel is not as out of the question as you might think. And the third reason why the sort of ultra-terrestrial thesis might be reasonable is that consciousness itself is so strange. We think of consciousness as being essentially the kind of thing that's happening in the brains of primates like us, but really, even the animal kingdom reveals some weird stuff about consciousness. Octopuses, for example, seem to have minds that are distributed through their entire bodies, through their 8 arms. They don't have a centralized sort of consciousness like we do. That's pretty weird and leads us to think, well, maybe there's ways in which consciousness could exist outside of the traditional biological sort of wet sack, so to speak. So that's an interesting point too. Maybe there's a way in which consciousness can move in subtle matter forms or even in utterly disembodied forms. So these are all reasons why the ultra-terrestrial thesis seems compelling for some people. If we apply Occam's razor to this stuff, remember Occam's razor, Occam was a philosopher medieval period, sort of early Renaissance, late medieval, early Renaissance period, in which he argued that if you have 2 competing theories for something happening like a UAP, then you should probably prefer the one that has less assumptions in it and go with the simpler story, the more parsimonious story, because that's probably going to be the right one. And it does seem like in order to explain UAPs, if you need to basically create interdimensional multiverses in which sort of entities or consciousness is crossing and technology is crossing between universes, that's a lot of assumptions. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's a lot of heavy lifting over there. This is why I like the cryptoterrestrial thesis. Less heavy lifting, less assumptions. Isn't it possible that we could have sort of creatures that were evolved on this planet that are just more sophisticated technologically than we know of and that are living in secret in some way? This requires less assumptions, albeit it's still a hard road to hoe. To the rescue of this thesis, my sort of cryptoterrestrial thesis, comes another hypothesis called the Silurian hypothesis. Now, the Silurian hypothesis, fans of Doctor Who will recognize the Silurians are a kind of highly advanced civilization that lived in the distant past and are still sort of with us. It's a Doctor Who episode. It's super fun and interesting. However, in 2018, 2 scientists, Adam Frank and Gavin Schmidt, used this sort of fictional advanced civilization, the Silurians, to develop what they call a Silurian hypothesis. And what this is basically the idea that on the Earth, we could have had an ancient advanced civilization that lived, they sort of speculate, maybe during the Carboniferous period, 350 million years ago. And what's interesting about this hypothesis is not that there's evidence for it or that it's even probable, but rather they ask this question: what would we see in the fossil record or in geology that would convince us that something like this might have happened? What are the markers of advanced civilizations? And the reason why that's a very interesting and challenging question is because with the eons of time that have gone by since the Carboniferous, let's say, 350 million years, nothing would be left. First of all, some things could fossilize, but we know the fossil record is incredibly incomplete, remarkably incomplete. So it's possible that many, many creatures lived for which we have discovered no fossils. Entirely possible and probable. Two, most, if not all, of the things that human beings have made and that are sort of artificial products of human civilization, culture, science, and know-how, all have a shelf life. They all decompose, they all decay. Everything falls apart and slowly disappears. Even plastic. Some people suggest that plastic bottles and plastic bags, even though like you talk about them like they're forever chemicals, actually will be completely broken down and decomposed somewhere between 100 years and 500 years. That means that our entire civilization, including all this plastic crap we've made, could be gone in basically, like, if we just stopped our civilization, in a couple of million years, there'd be no evidence that we ever existed. The buildings wouldn't be there, the plastics wouldn't be there, the metals wouldn't be there. All of this stuff breaks down over millions and millions of years. The only thing that might sort of remain over hundreds of millions of years might be some kind of radioactive waste, or possibly evidence of a huge climate change in sort of the sediment strata. That might be indications of a large-scale industrial society that maybe, grew and evolved and sort of advanced and progressed and eventually blew itself up, or maybe, those creatures went off planet. So this theory I find very fun and interesting. The scientists who come up with the Silurian hypothesis are not thinking that we're going to come up with like evidence of an ancient advanced civilization, some kind of Atlantis here on Earth. That's not what they're expecting to see. That's not what we see in terms of the evidence of our geology. Instead, they're thinking, what's going to happen when we get to Mars? What about the moons of Jupiter and other planets? What should we be looking for if there may have been some kind of advanced civilization there? But that's the sort of sober scientific use of the Silurian hypothesis. But it doesn't stop speculators and just sort of imaginative thinkers like me from considering the possibility that, hey, what if during the Cambrian explosion, which happened 530 million years ago, some weird phylogenetic branch of the tree grew, and when everything else was wiped out, during sort of this terrible sort of oxygen crash that occurred after the Cambrian explosion, maybe this phylogenetic tree kept evolving deep in the ocean, and we in fact got intelligent creatures that had technology, but they're just deep in the ocean somewhere and we have no contact with them. Or if you want to go all hollow earth on me, possibly that's what's happening. The creatures living inside the earth could have developed technology, and they're basically the cause of these UAPs that we're seeing. I really love this theory, even though I don't entirely believe it, and I just find it to be a great work of the imagination, but it's really fun. Here's the point. It's at least as reasonable as the aliens from other worlds coming, because at least we do know that intelligence can evolve on this planet, and that other animals do have some very rudimentary technology use. So maybe there's just a hidden cryptoterrestrial tradition, and we're just coming in contact with it. All right. So the reason for us to sort of look at this whole question of UAPs is not to sort of definitively settle it. How the hell am I going to do that? But rather to sort of notice this question about what makes conventional scientific knowledge and what makes sort of conventional knowledge generally, and what counts as useful or valuable unconventional knowledge. Because there's all kinds of unconventional knowledge. This is garbage. Okay, we know that. But sometimes, and we know this from science itself, there are these crazy revolutions in which a wacky, bizarre idea slowly builds up steam and then eventually causes a huge revolution. Why do some things that seem completely wacky and anomalous and bizarre eventually end up changing the way we see reality. So one of the thinkers that really wanted us to keep our minds open at all times was a writer named Charles Fort, who wrote a book in 1919 called The Book of the Damned. And even though this sounds like a horror sort of story, and it's going to involve like creatures and monsters and ghosts, it's not that at all. What he's talking about is the damned in this case are evidence points or data points that have been dismissed or damned by scientists. And Fort says, look, there's a lot of stuff we can't explain, and we should not dismiss it in some glib and sort of perfunctory manner. It might be that these weird things, whether it's UAPs or it's like miraculous kind of reports about, weeping statues, or it's sort of raining toads from the sky. All these crazy stories, Charles Fort thought, should be kept sort of nearby. Keep them close. This is what I think William James called this the unclassified residuum, stuff that doesn't quite fit in with our categories of knowledge or science yet, but they could end up being incredibly important and revolutionary. So in this tradition of epistemic humility, let's keep our eyes open and our minds open to the possibility of ultraterrestrials, in addition to, of course, extraterrestrials, and the cryptoterrestrials, which I want to sort of put my own personal plug in for. Okay, so some of you may have seen that amazing 1950s film, The Thing, and many more of you have probably seen the 1982 classic by John Carpenter, the remake of The Thing. At the end of The Thing, there's a hilarious, famous moment where the reporter picks up the phone and calls in to the newspaper just what he's been through. And he says famously, "Every one of you listening to my voice, tell the world, tell this to everybody wherever they are. Watch the skies. Everywhere. Keep looking." But I want to add to this famous line, don't just watch the skies, people. Let's be watching the oceans and, the interdimensional, universes too. Okay, come back next week, and join us for more of Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge.